welcome Johnny Beamish. Absolute pleasure to have you today on the future of wellbeing with Johnny Beamish. Before we start, Johnny, please would you be able to introduce yourself to those watching and listening today?
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much. Thanks for having me today. A great pleasure to be part of the work that you do. As you know, I've kind of followed you on LinkedIn for quite some time as well. So you asked me an interesting question, introduce myself. It in many ways kind of strikes to the core of our well-being and who we are, not what we are. I always introduce myself as Johnny Beamish. I have, I guess, a personality and I have a work title. I less on the work title. I mean, I'm senior director at Capgemini Invent. In terms of more of like who I am, I'm somebody who's probably very similar to you in terms of very passionate about people, about what makes people tick, and how that fits into sort of well-being. So it's a little bit about me. We met at Accenture, so I've got a management consulting background, sort of 12, 15 years in that. And through those experiences, I've learned a lot about who I am, what makes me tick, and what makes me healthy and a well-being.
I love it. We're going to come more into this, Johnny, and this is why you are perfect, absolutely perfect to feature on the future of wellbeing. But a little bit of context from myself, like Johnny said there, Johnny was at Accenture while I did my internship there in 2014-15, which was so long ago looking back. And I remember being on a project in Milton Keynes and just had a message pop up on Link. I think we used to call it Link there. And it just said, "Hey, Sanj," from Johnny Beamish, who was at the time a senior principal at Accenture. And I remember showing this to my mates. As you get excited, we were 2 months into an internship, and the highest person I think we'd spoken with at that point was a manager, and that was probably a hello. And then to get a message directly to you from a senior principal was almost a joke. I thought maybe somebody had gone on your laptop and sent send. And I remember showing it to some of the boys in Milton Keynes, and we thought, just
you've done something wrong.
What's that?
You've done something wrong.
Exactly. That's what we thought. That's what we thought. That's what we thought. And then, I remember we had a brief conversation there about a potential role in Copenhagen at the time, which was, being in Milton Keynes, being on your internship, that is the most exciting thing ever. Like, I remember I didn't sleep for, I think, 2 or 3 days. I remember I probably annoyed you a little bit too much chasing up. And then for many reasons, it didn't quite work out. But, I remember we kept in touch, and, you were really supportive for me throughout the internship. And then I remember there was an opportunity where myself and a colleague, Sam Phillipson, developed a digital proposal, which you helped us shape and get off the ground. And, you were a massive inspiration to us back then. And I'm so glad that we've been able to keep in touch over the last 5+ years now. So thank you so much for being here today. You've got a wealth of experience all over the world. And, I'm going to ask politely if we can tap into that today for the benefit of myself and the listeners. But first, Johnny, you spoke about well-being in the introduction, but how would you define well-being, and when would you say the period or phase of your life that you realize that well-being is a priority for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Sanj. I mean, my experience and my sort of coming to kind of realization about well-being came probably just before we met in sort of 2011 and 2012. And, it's a sort of, I guess it's that, typical consulting model where you're working flat out, you've got a client, and it was a challenging client. You've got everything else that's going on that, kind of your organization expects from you. And, sometimes you're not self-aware enough to understand what is actually happening to you. So work becomes you rather than, being kind of aware of it. I spent, I suppose, 9 or 10 months on this project. Didn't realize there was anything wrong with me. Didn't realize that, I was letting other things slip very badly, like sort of family, friends, relationships. Went on holiday, and it's the irony when you go on holiday when actually your body says, "Do you know what? Have a bit of this." And in my particular case, my have a bit of this was a heart attack, which age 38, I'd run 2 marathons that year. I was about as fit as I probably ever have been. So massive surprise, came out of the blue, and after that, I then sort of entered a period of, I was off work. I think I ended up being off work for 6 months because a lot of other things in terms of sort of mental health and how am I going to get back from this start to kick in as well. And I actually realized that the person that had caused this was actually me in many ways, by not sort of taking care of myself and focusing on, I guess, work at the expense of everything else. And, it was a real wake-up call. And through that period, I got a lot of help and met some very interesting people. And the big takeaway that I learned from that was the art of saying no.
Mm.
And it's very difficult in business, especially in sort of hierarchical organizations where the expectation is always yes. Johnny will get this done, give him more. He'll always say yes and he'll take on more, and you'll have experienced that as well. But actually, it was that learning to sort of say no was the big takeaway from that, and put me back on getting myself, well again.
Wow. Well, that's incredible. I had no idea about that, Johnny, and firstly, thanks for sharing that. But secondly, it's amazing how often, unfortunately, it takes that. I think the words you said was have a bit of this. I think that's a very extreme version of life saying have a bit of this. And unfortunately, there's a theme across those who prioritize their well-being to unfortunately go through a situation like that. Maybe not as severe as that often, but in terms of a shock. And it's unfortunate maybe that we have to go through that to then take that step back. Yeah,
absolutely. And it surprises me, and one of the gifts of insight that you get from having an illness, because as much of the recovery was mental as much as it was physical. In fact, the physical side of it was insignificant in comparison to the mental recovery and the emotional kind of impact of that. I'm surprised we don't see it more. I think what happens is actually people leave organizations rather than actually tackle it and try and get well, because they see it's a sort of mind shift set where people sometimes believe that it's being done to them.
Okay.
It's like the company has done this. Mm-hmm. The reality is it's not. I mean, it's your ability to say no. And the best people who I work with are the people who do say no. They learn to sort of balance what is achievable, not just from a personal, hey, I can't cope with this type, because that's at the extreme. Mm-hmm. They balance it with, I can only do so much to a level that is good and to a level that is great. The reality is you can't be great at everything all the time, and they just learn to say no and go, well, actually, I'd love to do that, but I'm not the right person, but I'll find you someone.
Yeah.
And that was my big takeaway. It was incredibly refreshing to be able to do that. Wow. I've been saying no ever since, right? But yeah, it's wow. I'm just surprised that I think companies have become much better at focusing on the horrible expression, which I'm sure you'll shoot me for saying. I hate the expression work-life balance.
Yeah.
It's a cop-out. It's a sort of corporate slogan around, let's sort of mitigate risk. Let's face it, right? That's what it is. Well-being to me is something much deeper than just having a work-life balance. It's deeper than that.
No, I love it. I respect you for that. So coming back to well-being then, so how would you define well-being? What would be your way to simply define well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I've a sort of virtual temperature check, and it's a very physical temperature check for me. If I'm waking up and I'm dreading something, then I'm not well, right? So and that what will play out in the sense of, am I getting a sort of stiff jaw from tension, right? So that tells me that either it's something that I'm either ill prepared for or haven't given enough time to. That's a sort of self-reflective thing. That to me is the well-being sense of actually just checking how you feel about something. Mm-hmm. And it dictates 2 or 3 things. You can either sort of say, okay, no, I can't, I need to leave that and I'll pass it to somebody else. And sure, when you're in a more senior position, it's easier to delegate that, and maybe that's not fair either. Who knows? Yeah. But to me, it's the ability to wake up and look forward to what I'm actually going to tackle today, and think, am I going to get something from this? Is someone else going to get something from it? Because again, when we look at well-being just from an individual perspective, the individual is influenced by external and other people. So you've got to be conscious of whether they're going to get something from it as well, if that that makes sense. So
No,
to me, it's a very physical check. Am I sort of not tense, not anxious, not worried about stuff. That's a big driver, because if you are, there's variables at play that you need to deal with.
Wow. No, I love that. I think what struck me most about that was your emphasis on the dread. There's a difference between dreading something and being maybe nervous in a healthy way. There's a huge difference, when you're thinking, oh gosh, like I really don't want to go to that meeting because I know somebody's going to ask me a question and I haven't prepared for it, and oh my God, I'm going to get exposed, and all that mentality is completely different to, oh, I'm not sure what's going to happen today, but let's just see.
Yeah, I guess even use your own path and your own choices in life. You've chosen to do something that you're passionate about, and you're good at, so you're less likely to wake up and go, oh, today's going to be a difficult day, right? and that has got so much to do with well-being as anything else, right? There are your book, there's a myriad of other factors, but the fact of just waking up and knowing that you're going to do something that gives you and somebody else something is a huge part of it.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you said that. There's 2.5 years into the journey now, and I've not woken up. I've woken up nervous, for presentation stuff, but I've never woken up or found it hard to get out of bed.
Nerves is normal, right?
Yeah.
Because let's face it, sometimes the jobs we do, you're on stage, right? It's a performance, and it's okay to be nervous. It's good to be nervous. Yeah. To be anxious and dreading something is not healthy. It's not healthy at all.
I love that. That's amazing. Thanks so much, Johnny. Next, come into what you do and maybe how it's been impacted by the pandemic. I know you were somebody, I think one of the first people again that I met or learned about who had such an international career. Like I remember when we had our conversations at the start, you were everywhere. And if you weren't everywhere, your people and your reach was everywhere. And you've been all over the place. But obviously since the pandemic, a lot of things have changed. I'm imagining that you've been at home for maybe the longest period in a long time. And so a two-part question for you, Johnny.
Yeah.
Firstly, how has the pandemic impacted the work that you do? And then secondly, how did it impact the work that you do, in those first few months? But secondly, how do you see in a COVID or post-COVID world the future of the consulting that you do?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to answer because we're still sort of, I guess, in the midst of this. I'm cautiously optimistic that we're turning a corner. The change is the work that I've done has always been sort of, I guess, half at home, half on client side, or half with people. I think the change is, as you and I are talking, it's this, right? It's the ability to sort of build a relationship and get things across in the same way as you would in a room. It's very difficult, I think, sometimes online. No matter how good Teams, Zoom, Skype, very, very difficult to really read what's actually happening and be able to sort of say, do you know what? Let's step away from that intensity at the moment and find out what's really going on. It's very hard to do that on Zoom and Skype. So that brings challenges. I think certainly in technology, a lot of stuff happens remotely anyway. So there's a balance between not a lot has changed and not a lot will change. So actually the real issue, I suspect, is will people really want to go back into the workplace? And if you think about the cities that we work in, and there's a fear that, and whether rightly or wrongly, has been instilled in people around this. We've learned to fear people. And then, whilst it's a very big concept leap, but that in itself is around the sort of the well-being space as well. We need to stop sort of being fearful and actually accept that life is as much about sort of social contact and interaction and workplace contact. Sorry, not context. That is how life works, right? And we've got to find a way of getting back to that. But I think what companies will try and do, and if they're smart, they will look at different ways of managing that in terms of, I think we'll see a lot more working from home, and we'll see a lot more growth in terms of people needing technology and consuming it for different ways. So there is a shift. April, May time, I suspect, will tell us what the appetite is for post COVID lockdown. I mean, there will be no post COVID. We're going to have to live with it forever. It's a virus, and it's not going away, despite what people would like us to believe. We have to learn to live with it, and that I work in change management, right? And it is funny to sort of think that's the sort of world that we need to adapt to. So how do you change based on that? We change our working patterns, we change our travel patterns, and I think good companies and good organizations will use that to their benefit to say, well, do you know what? If you feel that you don't want to travel at that time of day because it presents a risk to you, then don't travel at that time of day. And that's how change and people will adapt to it. So the world, I think, post April and May time will be about managing risk and people's expectations. I don't see us ever going back to the 9 to 5 of 200 people squeezed into a tube. People will be naturally fearful for that for the next 5-10 years.
Wow. Do you think the handshake will come back?
Do you know, it's a funny one. I'm a fan of the handshake, right? It's a sort of I'm not. Yeah, I don't know the answer. It's a human contact thing. It's an instinct. It's reciprocal. You put your hand out, I put my hand out. In different cultures, people kiss, and God, I always get that wrong. Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? And where do you put your hands? And oh my God, this is all very complicated. I think it will come back because that's who we are as people. It's very much part of relationships. It's that reciprocity. It's you're extending yourself. It's a funny one, that actually, because the fist pump or the elbow rub, it's just not the same, right? You do not get a sense of the person or the energy, right? I mean, it's a touch thing. When you touch somebody, you get a sense of who they are. Without being too philosophical about it, but
no, I agree, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the world has seen throughout this pandemic, is that because people are, physically apart, they're not interacting. And even if they are physically together, they're not handshaking, they're not hugging, they're not doing the kisses on the cheek. And that is almost what leaves a bigger gap than the conversation almost. It's that little bond before, when you meet somebody for a coffee, you can tell so much about a person in that first 30, 40 seconds. Just because of the way you rub shoulders, or the energy is real that you feel of other people, for sure. Yeah,
and it will come back, I suspect. But again, people will be cautious about it. It's once people realise that you can't get it just from a handshake, right? You've got to do something. And maybe it would be horrible if we have to sort of handshake and then wash our hands afterwards, because that is almost. One is a sign of respect, and here's who I am. Let's meet. And then the other is, I'm just washing you away. It'd be counterproductive. It'd be horrible. I suppose, when you say about washing hands, it's almost like, with the cheers, glass to glass, will that be the same? Because, people would have put their mouths over the cups, and, the whole, maybe they won't cheers as well. It's totally. And it's a fascinating sort of side conversation in many ways, but the ritual of that is all about social connection, right?
Absolutely,
in Scotland we have it's called a quick, which is like tends to be made of pewter, and you put whiskey in it, and it's a friendship thing, and you circulate that. Okay. And the Fijians do it as well with, is it not cava? That's Spanish. Guava, I think it is. Or maybe it's an hallucinogenic drink. So there's lots of rituals based. We're going way off topic, but there's lots of rituals that we'll see either decline or with caution. Wow.
Yeah, and and that's before we go the impact of it to the younger people. Let's not go there right now. But in terms of the younger people who've not been exposed to the handshake, or as a 5-year-old seeing people walking around with masks on for a whole year of your life, that's 20% of your life. You just begin to accept that, and whether it's 200 people on a tube, or whether it's 50,000 people at a concert or a sports match, and rushing to go to the toilet in half time, all these amazing frantic situations that people used to hate but love at the same time. Those are questions beyond.
But they're important, right? And we are on tangent, but hey, that is about well-being, right? Because social interaction is 100% the core of it. And if we lose, we've got to be careful about what we lose and what we give up. Especially when there are just some things that are common sense and practical, but when they're mandated, we overstep the line a little bit there when we start mandating people's social interactions. But anyway, we are massively on tangent, but interesting. That's your second book.
No, I love it. Coming back to the workplace, Johnny, and specifically what you do on a day-to-day basis. Of course, the role of the leader in organizations, in teams over the last 10 to 15 years has changed drastically. Like now leaders are very active human beings, physically as well as mentally and in the workplace. And the persona of a leader is very different to what it was maybe when you started your career. So in terms of somebody with so much experience of firstly, working in huge organizations, working under many, many leaders, but then also yourself now as a fantastic leader and somebody who seems, to really, really care, which is something that comes across here for sure. You have that really authentic vibe. Without trying to answer your question, or the question that I'm about to ask you, what two traits would you say are absolutely crucial to be a world-class leader? Two traits.
Yeah, it's not a hard question for me to answer because I kind of know the answer instinctively. I have a bit of a problem with the concept of leadership in itself, because it's an ism, right?
Yep.
And if we look at the sort of thin veneer of the business world, the sort of LinkedIn, the look at me and the I'm a leader, you've got a lot of that going on. But you also have then, and without being overly cynical, somebody who's running a call center, who sees themselves as an inspirational leader and reads books on it. That's great, and if that makes them better, that's fine. But let's not sort of shy away from the fact that leadership is it's a thing. It's not it's not a thing that can be sort of defined as easily as that. So maybe let me set my stall on that. I've worked with some great people in my career, and interesting. The start of my career, I was in the police, and the police is an interesting kind of place to start the conversation, because actually it's a hierarchy for a start. So you start at the bottom of the pile when you're a constable. You answer to a series of people, and many organizations are set up that way. The interesting thing about the police is it's a hierarchy that works because everybody has autonomy. Everybody can make a decision in the moment, whereas you take those parallels across to other organizations. Consulting, you can't make a decision in the moment, you have to escalate. So the hierarchy doesn't work in that sense. Wow. So my realization on this was actually the first time I was at a scene that was impactful. There'd been a stabbing. I knew where the suspect was. I dealt with the body, not the body, sorry, that sounds really bad. The victim, which later became a body, unfortunately. But I was the first person on scene, and it was all on me, if you like, to sort of deal with that, to bring in the right resources. And I'd been in the job maybe 3 months. Wow. And I knew what to do. You have a playbook, right? It's you seal the area, you know where the accused is, you take action. And what then the police tend to do is you bring together other colleagues, so you go there, you go there. It doesn't matter how junior you are in that position, you're in charge until someone stands you down. And because it was a serious incident, we had a chief superintendent who would then come and become commander, right? So the concept of leadership is that person, he or she is the commander. I ran that situation until I physically arrested that person. 45 minutes later, I ran everything. It's like, I need this, I need that. Bring me the dog handler, bring me backup, bring me protective equipment. And at no stage did the commander step in and go, Johnny, stand down because you're too junior, right? And that to me was sort of true leadership. That kind of person was there in the background waiting to support. Wow. Never waiting for me to fail, right? It's a different way of looking at it. And, and I worked through that sort of hierarchy and structure and actually realized that it works in those situations. So maybe what I'm trying to say is, leadership isn't real until it's happening, and you can prepare yourself for that, sure. And, the concept of somebody always being a leader, I think is an unusual one. When you put in an Excel into a meeting and somebody goes, you demonstrated good leadership there, I'm like, really? So I have a healthy cynicism about the term, which I'm sure is fairly obvious. So maybe that's a long way of answering.
No, I love it.
The first part is leadership is a fluid thing, and the mantle comes to you. It's knowing when it's in front of you and doing something. So you might have it once and then never again, right? So we're not all leaders always. Maybe it's a myth to dispel. That sounds overly cynical. I've just seen and read too much bad material on leadership that people can sometimes try and boil it down to an ism. It's a moment, and it's about doing the right thing in that moment. Wow. And you may never get recognized for it. It may never come again. But, you know, give me an example of a time when you were a leader. Boom, it might only be one vignette, and that's right. So that's one on that one. And the other one is, I think I alluded to earlier on, is it's about trust, right? And to me, a lot of everything comes down to trust. You know, what we do and what we say, we're either building trust or we're not. So if you don't trust the people you work with, you know, is there a leadership problem there? For sure there is, because that person is either self-interested or, you know, they're not supporting you, so you're not going to trust them. You know, and likewise, you've got to trust the people who work for you. And you said something interesting. You used the word care. I have this sort of very naive concept. Maybe it's one of the next big thing here. You can stick this in for your next book. I think you got to love people a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we're not in love with everybody. It's a very different thing. Absolutely. It's a very different thing than, you know, you might hate somebody that you work with and not get on with them, but you've got to have that sort of care and love and go, well, that is their job and they need to be able to be successful at this. And that's the outward projection. So, you know, good leaders, I think, are very, very good at that, where they're like, well, I can see beyond how I feel about that person, but, you know, do I care enough? Do I love enough? I remember having a conversation actually with a bunch of really enthusiastic new starts in Accenture around that. And I think they thought I was crazy, because I kind of said, like, you know, you got to love people a little bit. But I really think you do. Otherwise, you know, you're just doing things in a process-driven way. Otherwise, you know, you've got to extend you a little bit. So yeah, maybe that's the third thing. Is it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think again, you know, in terms of exposure within the corporate world, I think you said it spot on in terms of leadership is always assumed, and it's always there. So when you are, you know, starting your career, you do have that almost protection system in place to say, you know what, it's almost like you're identifying the problem as opposed to thinking about it. And again, you know, from exposure to some really good leaders in moments, you know, for myself, it's like, you know, you can come to me with a problem, but you've also got to come with a solution. And again, I think the person who said that to me was very frustrated that people below him in that organization at that time would often be, you know, problem focused and just say, you know, look, boss, this has happened, you know, as opposed to reporting things, as opposed to saying, you know, this is what happened. Here's some detail around it. And these are what I think are the first steps that we could do, but let me know what you think and let's, you know, go and fix this.
And that's a great example, you know. And if you sort of play it back a little bit, when I've sort of led teams, horrible word, when I've had responsibility for people, you know, to me, and maybe it is that poor analogy, the person who is driving the Excel, they're there in the moment. Don't ever cut in. You know, let them lead it. Let them drive that conversation. If they need support around the outcome and what next and what happens, and as you say, so here's how you solve the problem. That's their moment of leadership, right? And being there to support them, and not sort of wanting to take it away from them because you're the kind of senior person. You know, that's not fair. It's not respectful to them.
I love that. I think I know you're a sports fan too, Johnny. And you know, one analogy that I'm thinking of here is I heard recently how you know, when somebody crosses a football, they cross it to the place where they want the forward or, you know, striker to be, you know. And I guess, you know, I'm thinking of the support in somebody as opposed to waiting for them to fail. You know, you don't cross, you know, you see that in sports teams, you know, you don't put the ball where you think that Sanj might be because he doesn't know to get into the box and that kind of thing. You still put the ball into the box, hoping that, you know, Sanj will get into the box. And that's where you build forward. You know, you can't just always pass it backwards because again, how would I know where to be unless, you know, you put it where I should be, kind of thing.
Yeah. And you know, that's the trust thing as well, right? You know, you're going to trust that, you know, your colleague or friend or, you know, a teammate is going to be there for you, right? And yeah, I mean, it is a complex thing to define, but you know, I'm less into isms and theories and books on it. And in fact, I cannot think of, you know, maybe more than 2 books that I've ever read that have made me go, that's interesting from a leadership perspective, because it just sells books, right? Let's face it. That sounds very cynical, but maybe the ultimate definition is, it's a moment, right?
Yes,
you're a leader in that moment. So should we call it that?
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah, I think that's gonna
There's probably a book called Leadership in the Moment.
Of course.
We'll be getting sued by somebody.
yeah, absolutely. And then so I think that sets us up perfectly for the last question about well-being, and again, in terms of an action, in terms of something that those who are responsible for teams, let's remove the leadership word for now, but in terms of those who are responsible for teams, what is one thing, if you were to just pick one, and I'm conscious of not asking you for 3, 4, 5, or 7, because I know there's plenty out there, and I love specificity, but what would you say that one thing that those responsible for teams can do within their teams to sustain a culture of well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it goes back to the reason why someone's not well, right? And that to me tends to be around either a lack of trust or a lack of honesty, right? Because, if somebody is struggling, and maybe it's a very British thing, I don't know, we're very bad at asking for help, and help me is probably the biggest trust builder in a weird sort of way, because you're making yourself vulnerable, right? And I think to foster a culture where people can ask for help without consequence is incredibly important for everybody's well-being. And when my kids ask me for help, there's no judgment. You don't go, you're thick because you need help with that, right? Sorry, that's probably not a very PC term, but you know what I mean. But yet in the workplace, the expectations is that we're right 100% of the time, and the reality is we're not, and we're all learning. So building that sort of culture of honesty and trust, I think, is incredibly important. So I need to be able to put my hand up and say, I'm struggling, or I need help. Now, struggling, nobody wants to admit that, but hey, we all do it sometimes. So you need to be able to do that without repercussion.
Yeah, I love that. I really appreciate that, Johnny. I think, in terms of a theme, often it spoke about, how in the older world, the more traditional world, it was always best to fit in. Whereas now it's seen as better to stand out, but for the right reasons. If somebody's standing out for the right reason and genuinely asking support because they don't understand something, that's a sign of strength. Traditionally, that would be like, oh, Sanj doesn't get it. That's why he's asking. Everyone looks differently. You think back to when you're at school and, people laugh at the person who gets a question wrong or needs, that second explanation just because it didn't, sit well with them the first time, or they maybe misheard one word. But what you said there is really powerful to in that moment, coming back to moments, but when somebody is vulnerable, to ask, what we do in that moment is vital, is really, really vital.
Yeah. And, maybe there's another layer as well that, not only do you need to build that culture, but you need to be sort of, let's take it back to the care and love part. You need to sort of care and love about the people that you work with enough to be able to sense it. You should know your colleagues well enough to know when someone's struggling. And when it's obvious, it's too late, right? When somebody is off, it's too late, or if somebody, at the start of COVID was the most interesting thing for me, was watching people's behaviors. And, we had this horrible expression saying we're all in this together. I mean, the reality is we're not all in this together, because, some people were still working, some people were, on the front line, some people were on furlough. We were all doing things differently, and people were behaving bizarrely, right? Yep. And at that stage, when you see the strange behavior, it's just way too late. If somebody snapped at you or shouted at you, it's too late. So I guess being, if you're in a position where that somebody's struggling, do something, right? Because I've always believed that from hard lessons, that if you do nothing, it becomes a problem. But if you do something, you'll never know.
Yeah,
but you've done the right thing.
And I think it comes back to you can't not have an impact.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the extensions of that analogy about the same boat, and I smiled there because, I've started speaking about a different perspective of that. And it's not that we're in the same boat, but we're in the same storm, but in different boats.
That's very good.
Some boats are stronger than others. And, how we are as a boat, depends on how well we deal with that storm. And, and I know you know a little bit about it too, so I'll go one step further and say that, boats don't sink because of the water around them. They only sink because of the water inside them.
I like that. That's a very, very good way to draw a line on that. That appeals to me. I used to be in the RNLI as well, so it kind of appeals to my my sort of saving people at sea. That's a very nice analogy. There you go. I like that.
You're welcome. Right, super, Johnny. That is one of the most thrilling conversations that I believe I've been a part of, and I can't wait to listen back to it. But you've been very raw, you've been very vulnerable, you've been very honest, and I appreciate all of those qualities that you've shared with us today. So thank you so much, Johnny, and we will see each other very, very soon.
You are very kind. Thank you. Very very flattered. Delighted to help with your project. I think the stuff that you do is very interesting and should be inspirational for people, rather than seen as a nice to have. As as we were talking even before we had the recording, these are not interventions. And it shouldn't be interventions. It should be a culture of focus on well-being, and not that horrible work-life balance nonsense. It's deeper and broader than that.
Wow. No, I love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Johnny. And I'm just going to stop the recording now, but we'll see you very soon.
All right. See you soon.